The year was in the late 1870s, and the sky was a sheet of pale, hammered silver over the Wyoming territory. It was the season of dry wind, a restless breath that came up from the Kansas border, carrying nothing but dust and the smell of cured grass. The land was thirsty. The air was thin. In the small, hopeful scar of a town called Larkspur Bend, dust was the only thing that moved with any certainty. It gathered in the horse troughs. It coated the new raw lumber of the telegraph office. It filmed the windows of the Javelina saloon, where men spoke in low voices, and the small, brave steeple of the First Baptist Church, where they prayed for rain and deliverance. The talk was always the same. It was about the railroad, a black iron spine pushing west, and it was about Finch and Partners, the land company that moved ahead of the iron, buying, pressing, and sometimes it was whispered, forcing men off their homesteads. Names were spoken with a mix of hope and fear. Silas Finch, the railroad, and a newer, darker name, the Black Sash, a band of riders who seemed to answer to no law but the one that came from the deepest pockets. Eleanor Finch arrived on the afternoon stage, a solitary woman against a landscape of hard men and harder horizons. She was past 25 years of age, and she moved with a purpose that defied the heat. She was a teacher by trade but a cartographer by passion and profession. Her luggage was heavy, not with dresses, but with the tools of mapping a heavy brass theodolite, tripods, neatly rolled charts, and cases of sharpened pencils. She was independent, a woman who preferred the clear logic of longitude and latitude to the muddy compromises of society. She was practical. Her dark hair was pinned back, not for style, but for work. She kept her own counsel, her private thoughts locked away as securely as her delicate instruments. Her presence in Larkspur Bend was simple. She was hired to survey the final route, to confirm the lines her uncle, Silas Finch, had drawn for his partners. She believed in accuracy. She believed that a map was a promise. She checked into the town's only hotel, a clean but threadbare establishment. The proprietor looked at her name on the ledger. Finch. His eyes flickered, but he said nothing. In this town, that name was its own introduction. The next morning, she went to the livery and then to the office of the marshal, a man named Bram. She needed a guide, not a trapper, not a prospector. She needed someone who knew the land as it was, not as they hoped it would be. Someone who could guide her to the old survey markers, the stone piles and bluffs mentioned in the county records. Marshal Bram, a man who seemed worn smooth by the wind, shifted in his chair. He said that was difficult work, dangerous. He mentioned the divided loyalties in town. Half the homesteaders were eager to sell to Finch and Partners. The other half were digging in, their rifles cleaned and ready. And there were others, people who did not respect the new fences. Eleanor was direct. She was not interested in the politics. She was interested in the geography. She would pay fairly for a reliable man. Bram sighed. He said there might be one, not a townsman, a Cheyenne, Tiva Redhawk. He was in town. Tiva Redhawk was not a man who blended in, yet he made himself small. He stood in the sliver of shade cast by the general store, a figure of profound stillness. He was a warrior, but his bearing was one of sober discipline, not aggression. His face was calm, but his eyes missed nothing the nervous homesteader buying cartridges, the confident railroad agent leaving the telegraph office, the woman in the practical skirt asking questions at the marshal office. He knew her name, Finch. It was the name on the new no hunting signs, the name that was pushing his people from the last of their traditional grounds, the name that meant starvation or war. But Tiva was not in Larkspur Bend because of the fences. He was there because of a tragedy that clung to his family like the dust. He was there for his young cousin, Kohea, a boy of 16 summers who had been taken by Marshal Bram 2 days prior. The charge was horse theft, a claim Tiva knew was false. The boy had been retrieving a pony that had strayed. To free him, Tiva could not use force. That would bring ruin. He had to navigate the white man's system. He had spoken to the elders. The answer was a gesture, not a bribe, but a profound offering to offset the alleged crime. A traditional payment of blankets, cured hides, and 3 fine horses to the rancher who claimed the loss. It was a ransom dressed in the clothes of custom. To acquire these things, Tiva needed money, white man money. He saw Eleanor Finch walk out of the marshal office, her face set with frustration. She looked across the dusty street. Her eyes met his. She crossed. There was no hesitation in her step. She stood before him. She was tall for a woman. He was taller. They are professional. They are distant. She said, "Marshal Bram tells me you know this land." Tiva nodded. The land knew him. "I am Eleanor Finch. I am mapping the boundary lines for the new survey. I need a guide to take me to the old markers. 3 days, maybe 4. He remained silent, his gaze steady. He was weighing her name against his need. The boy Kohia's face flashed in his mind. She mistook his silence for something else. "I pay in cash. At the end of each day." Tiva spoke. His voice was low, like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. "Tomorrow, sunrise." He did not ask about the pay. He did not ask where they were going. He had accepted. Eleanor felt a strange mix of relief and unease. She nodded. Sunrise. They left Larkspur Bend as the sky turned from gray to apricot. The air was cool, but held the promise of blistering heat. They rode for an hour without speaking. Eleanor led her pack mule, loaded with her instruments. Tiva rode slightly ahead, his body moving with the easy rhythm of his horse. He carried a rifle in a scabbard, but his eyes were his primary weapon. He scanned the horizon, reading the movements of hawks, the sudden flight of prairie dogs, the subtle discolorations in the grass that spoke of other riders. Eleanor was all business. She found her first reference point, a tall spire of sandstone. She dismounted, unpacked the theodolite, and began her precise, methodical work. She scribbled calculations in her notebook, her brow furrowed in concentration. The labor was hard. Sweat ran down her temples, leaving pale trails in the dust that already caked her skin. Tiva stood watch. He found a high point and simply waited. He was a guardian, not a participant. He watched her work. She was meticulous. She measured, wrote, measured again. She did not cut corners. For a person with her name, she seemed to have an honest respect for the lines. They stopped at noon by a shallow, muddy creek. They ate separately. Eleanor had hardtack and dried apples. Tiva had a strip of jerky. She spoke, breaking the professional silence. "How long have your people lived here?" Tiva looked at the creek, at the old cottonwoods that leaned over it. Before the name Wyoming was spoken, before the lines were drawn on paper. Eleanor absorbed this. She was a woman of lines. It was a difficult concept. In the afternoon, the tension found them. They topped a long, rolling ridge. Below them, a new fence cut a sharp, geometric scar across the land. Fresh pine posts, gleaming wire. It stretched for miles. Tiva reined in his horse. His body went rigid. A new sign was nailed to a post. No hunting, no trespassing. By order of Finch and partners. This was the new boundary, the one that was causing the whispers and the anger. Eleanor pulled her map from her satchel. She unrolled it, bracing it against the wind in the saddle. She studied it, her finger tracing a line. She looked at the fence. She looked at her map. "This is not right," she said, more to herself than to him. "What is not right?" Tiva asked. "The fence. It is too far north, according to the original survey. The property line follows the creek bed." She pointed. "That fence is a full mile north of the water. It takes the water." Tiva said nothing. He already knew this. Eleanor urged her horse forward, down the slope, until she reached the fence line. She followed it west for half a mile, her eyes scanning the ground. "There," she said. She dismounted and walked to a pile of rocks. In the center was not an old, weathered stone marker. It was a new wooden stake, pounded deep into the ground. The earth around it was dark and freshly disturbed. She could see the splintered marks of the heavy hammer that had driven it, carved into the side. The letters F and P were sharp and new. Eleanor ran her fingers over the carving. She looked at her map, her face pale beneath the dust. Her calculations, her profession, her entire sense of order was being challenged by a piece of wood. "This is wrong. The marker is moved." Tiva had dismounted and stood beside her. He looked at the crude stake. He looked at the thirsty grass. He looked at the distant hills, which held the memory of 1,000 buffalo hunts. He looked at her, this woman with the name of the man who had done this. He said, "Your map is true. The markers are lies." The air over the prairie had turned yellow. Eleanor Finch stood from her calculations, a feeling of deep, professional violation settling in her stomach. The crude stake marked F and P was a mockery of her work. Her map, the true map, was a lie in her hand because the land itself was being rewritten by force. Tiva Redhawk was not looking at the stake. He was looking west. The pale silver sky was gone, erased by a rising wall of bruised, churning brown. The wind had died, creating a terrible, vacuum-sealed silence. He said 2 words, his voice flat, yet urgent. "We move." Before she could question, the first gust hit them. It was not wind. It was a physical blow. 1,000,000 tiny needles of sand and grit that stung her face and stole her breath. Her horse screamed and reared, pulling the reins from her hand. The pack mule brayed, turning in circles. Tiva was on his horse in one fluid motion. He grabbed the bridle of her terrified mount, his own horse holding steady not from calm, but from an iron grip on its reins. He shouted, but the sound was ripped from his mouth. "Get down! Cover your face!" He did not wait. He half pulled her from the saddle, pushing her toward a shallow washout, a scar in the earth shielded by a low overhang of sandstone. He forced the horses down into the gully, their bodies creating a partial wall. He pushed Eleanor against the rock. "Stay." The world dissolved. The sun vanished. The sky was not dark. It was a thick, roaring yellow. It was impossible to see, impossible to breathe. The wind howled, a high, thin sound like a dying animal. Eleanor pressed her face into her arms, her body trembling. This was not weather. It was an apocalypse. Tiva stood braced against the rock face, his back to the worst of it, a living shield for her and the horses. He had pulled his neckerchief up over his nose and mouth, and then something else was in the shelter. It was small, and it stumbled in from the yellow chaos, falling against Tiva's legs. It was a boy, no more than 6 or 7 years old. He was gasping, his eyes wide with terror. He wore the leggings and simple tunic of the Lakota. He was alone. Tiva's hand went from his knife to the boy's shoulder in a single, fluid change of intent. He pulled the child into the shelter, pressing him between his own body and the rock, shielding him. He spoke, not in Cheyenne, but in the shared, rapid sign talk of the plains, and then a few words of Lakota. The boy, shaking, signed back. He was from a camp. He had been chasing a rabbit. The wind came. He had lost his mother. Eleanor watched, her own fear momentarily eclipsed by the small, desperate drama. Tiva was calm, his presence a solid object in the screaming void. Through the grit, visibility came and went in waves. In one of the brief lulls, when the dust thinned to a yellow haze, Tiva's head snapped up. Eleanor saw them too. Shapes, dark figures on horseback, barely visible, moving slowly through the storm. They were not seeking shelter. They were working. There were 6 riders. They were identifiable only by the dark cloths tied around their necks and pulled up over their faces. The black sash. They were near a line of newly driven survey stakes, the ones Eleanor recognized as marking the proposed railroad spur. They dismounted, fighting the wind. 2 of them were struggling with a heavy, dark object, a wooden chest. Even in the storm, they moved with purpose. They dug a shallow hole, dropped the chest in, and quickly began to cover it. They were burying it, using the storm as their cover. No one else would be mad enough to be out in this. The wind roared again, a solid wall of dirt, and the figures vanished. For an hour, the world was only the sound of the wind. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the storm passed. The wind dropped, leaving an eerie, exhausted silence. The sky was visible again, but it was a sick, brownish color. The entire world was coated in a fine layer of silt. Eleanor spat the grit from her mouth. Her instruments, she thought with a pang of panic. She scrambled to her pack mule, finding the leather cases coated but sealed. Tiva was already moving. He handed the trembling Lakota boy a water flask. He said to Eleanor, "Watch him." He walked, not to their horses, but out onto the newly washed plain. He moved toward the railroad stakes. Eleanor saw him stop. While he was gone, she pulled out her notebook and pencil. Her hands were shaking, but her mind was clear. She climbed the low sandstone ridge. From there, she could see the butte to the east and the bend in the dry creek to the south. She began to sketch. Using the triangulation skills of her trade, she mapped the spot where the riders had been. She marked it with a small, precise X. Tiva returned. His face was grim. He said, a new stake, F and P, driven into the ground where the riders were. It is on the old hunting path. He looked at her sketch. He pointed, there. She nodded. He did not ask for her help. He walked to the spot. He began to dig with his hands, the earth still soft and damp from the silt. Eleanor followed. She unhooked the small, sharp trowel she used for geological samples from her pack and joined him. They hit wood. It was a footman's chest, bound in iron, with a simple, heavy lock. Tiva did not bother with the lock. He used the flat end of her trowel as a lever, put his weight against it, and the wood splintered. He pulled the lid open. It was full of paper. Eleanor reached in, her fingers brushing past stacks of blank, official-looking documents. They were land transfer deeds, identical to the ones filed at the courthouse. At the bottom, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was a heavy, cold object. She unwrapped it. It was a steel seal, heavy in her hand. She stared at it, her blood running cold. She knew this design. It was the official seal of the Fremont County Court, and beneath it, a single, thin ledger. She opened it. It was not accounts. It was a list of names. Jedediah Smith, Amos Horn, Peter Cartwright, names she had heard in Larkspur Bend. Homesteaders. Beside each name was a simple notation, slated for removal. "This is," she whispered, her voice hoarse. She looked at the seal again. She had seen one just like it, its twin in her Uncle Silas's office in Cheyenne, the one he used, the one she was authorized to use, to certify her survey maps as true and correct for the Finch and Partners Corporation. She had never seen these deeds. She had never authorized this. Tiva looked at the list. He looked at the seal. His eyes were cold and clear. He understood it all. "It is a trap," he said. She looked at him, not understanding. He pointed to the fake marker they had found earlier. "They move the lines. They build the fences on our land. My people resist. They must, or they starve." He tapped the ledger. "The Black Sash rides. They do not attack my people. They attack these people, the homesteaders." He ran his finger down the list. Eleanor felt the sickness rising in her throat. "They are removed," Tiva said. "The homesteaders who will not sell, they are gone. Then your uncle's men use these." He picked up a blank deed. "They write the name. They use the seal. It is all law. It is all legal. The land belongs to Finch and Partners, and the blood is on Cheyenne hands." This was not just fraud. It was a plan for a massacre, one that would be sanctioned by the law, a law forged from this very seal. Eleanor stood up. The dust on her face felt like a mask. "My name. They are using my name for this." She began to repack the chest, her movements quick and angry. "We are taking this, where Tiva asked, to Marshal Bram. He is the law. He will see justice done." Tiva looked at her, his expression unreadable. He did not trust the white man's law, but he looked at the chest. It was powerful. He nodded. He picked up the Lakota boy, who had fallen asleep from exhaustion. They rode back to Larkspur Bend in silence, the heavy chest tied securely on the pack mule. Hidden under a bedroll, the town felt different. The men watching from the saloon porch were no longer just idle townsfolk. They were threats. The telegraph office, its windows dark, seemed to be listening. Marshal Bram was in his office, his feet on his desk. He looked surprised to see them back before dark, and even more surprised to see the Lakota child. Eleanor did not wait. She had Tiva bring in the chest. She opened it on Bram's floor. She laid out the blank deeds, the list, and finally, the steel seal. She told him everything, the storm, the riders, the new stake. She was precise, logical, a cartographer laying out the facts. Bram's face grew longer and more grave with every word. He picked up the seal, weighing it in his hand. "This is a profound accusation. Miss Finch." He looked genuinely shocked. "Silas Finch." He shook his head, as if clearing it. "You were right to bring this to me. This is conspiracy." He gathered the papers and the seal and put them back in the chest. He placed the chest behind his desk. "I will lock this in my safe. It is evidence." He looked at them, his eyes full of fatherly concern. "You must not speak of this to anyone. Do you understand? If these men are as dangerous as you say, your lives are in peril." Eleanor felt a wave of relief. He believed them. "Thank you, Marshal," she said. He nodded. "Now, about this boy. The child, Ampa, was awake now." Tiva spoke. "His people are camped by the Red Bluffs. We will take him." Bram held up a hand. "Not tonight. It is too dangerous. You have stirred up something terrible. You stay in town. Get a room at the hotel. I will have my deputy watch you. For your protection," Tiva said. "We will camp on the edge of town. With the boy. We will take him home at sunrise." Bram seemed to want to argue, then nodded. "Sunrise. Be safe." They left the office. The street was dark. As they stepped onto the boardwalk, Tiva paused. He turned his head, listening. Eleanor stopped. "What is it?" She heard it then, the side door to Bram's office, the one that led directly to the telegraph station, opened with a soft click. A moment later, from the supposedly empty telegraph office, came the faint, unmistakable, rhythmic tapping of the key. Bram was not locking up the evidence. He was sending a message. Tiva looked at Eleanor. His eyes were not angry. They were just right. They were standing in the open, exposed. Tiva felt the shift, the weight of eyes on his back. A man in the shadows of the livery. Another across the street, lighting a cigarette, his face briefly illuminated and then gone. They were not protected. They were marked. The little boy, Ampa, tugged on Tiva's shirt. He was crying softly. He wanted his mother. Tiva lifted him up. He spoke in a low voice, meant for the boy but loud enough for Eleanor. "Do not be afraid. Your camp is at Red Bluffs. We will go tomorrow." They found a small, sheltered spot in a dry creek bed where a few other native families were camped. It was safer than the hotel. Tiva shared his blanket with the boy. Eleanor sat with her back against her saddle, her mind racing. Bram, even Bram. The night was cold. The moon was a sliver. Just before the first hint of dawn, when the darkness was at its deepest, a sound jolted Eleanor awake. It was a shout, far off, from the direction of the Red Bluffs. A woman screamed. Then, the flat, ugly crack of a rifle. Tiva was on his feet, his rifle in his hand. He stared into the darkness, toward the sound. Eleanor stood beside him, her heart hammering. Another shot. Tiva looked at her, his face a mask of iron in the gloom. "That is the boys' camp." They did not wait. Tiva did not ride. He ran. He moved through the pre-dawn gloom with a silence that was unnatural, his rifle held low. Eleanor was clumsy behind him, her boots slipping on the loose rock. her heart a cold hammer against her ribs. She left the mule and her instruments, taking only her horse and a water canteen. The little boy, Ampa, rode with Tiva, his small hands gripping the horse's mane. The smoke was thick as they cleared the creek bed, the smell of burning hide and scorched earth stinging their eyes. The camp at Red Bluffs was not a camp. It was a ruin. 2 lodges were blazing, the fire eating the painted symbols on their skins. Belongings were scattered, sacks of grain ripped open, beads crushed into the dirt. A woman was crying, a high keening sound that cut through the crackle of the flames. Tiva slid from his horse and put the boy down. His command a low hiss. "Stay." He moved toward the sound. Eleanor followed, her eyes scanning the chaos. This was not a battle. It was a dispersal, a brutal, calculated act of terror. They found her behind a smoldering lodge, a Lakota woman, her face streaked with soot and terror. Ampa ran to her. "Mother!" She was alive, clutching her shoulder, a dark stain spreading through her deerskin dress. Tiva knelt, his examination swift. The wound was on her upper arm. Bloody, but it looked to be a graze. "What happened?" Tiva asked in her tongue. "The woman, Wiyaka, was shaking, trying to hold her son. Men, they came from the dark. They rode through us. They set the fires." "How many?" She shook her head. 8, maybe 10. They wore, she pointed to her neck, dark cloths. Eleanor felt her blood freeze. The black sash. They were looking for the boy. Wiyaka gasped. They were shouting his name. "Ampa." They said the boy was stolen. They called us thieves. Eleanor and Tiva exchanged a look. Bram's telegraph. It had not just been a warning. It had been an order, a justification. A man, a big man, he was shouting. Wiyaka continued, the words tumbling out. He said, "Find the boy and the cartographer woman." Eleanor stepped back, a cold dread washing over her. They were not looking for Tiva. They were looking for her. "Did you hear a name?" Tiva asked, his voice steady. "The big one. The others called him Clay. Clay Dwyer." Eleanor had heard that name. He was her uncle's foreman, the man who ran the land acquisitions, the man who got things done. Tiva looked at the ground, his eyes sharp. The tracks were clear in the soft earth. Heavy boots, deep heels, the kind bounty hunters wore. Not moccasins. Tiva looked at Wiyaka. "Can you ride?" She nodded, her jaw set, though she was pale. "We go back to the town," Tiva said. Eleanor was stunned. "Back, Tiva. They are hunting us. Bram is part of it." Tiva was already pulling his horse over, preparing to lift the woman. "We need 2 things. We need bandages, and we need to see the marshal's face when he lies." The ride back was tense and exposed. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, a beautiful dawn over a morning of profound ugliness. They re-entered Larkspur Bend as the town was coming to life. The blacksmith was opening his doors. A few early risers looked at their strange procession, the Cheyenne warrior, the disheveled white woman, the wounded Lakota mother and her child, with open curiosity. They did not stop at the doctor's office. Tiva led them straight to the marshal's door. He hammered on it with his fist. Marshal Bram opened it, his suspenders down, his face slick with shaving soap. He looked annoyed, and then his eyes widened. "Miss Finch, what is the meaning of this?" Eleanor pushed past him. Tiva followed, helping Wiyaka into a chair. The woman was gray with pain. "The camp at Red Bluffs was attacked," Eleanor said, her voice shaking with a cold rage she did not know she possessed. "By Clay Dwyer and the Black Sash. They were looking for me." Bram put his razor down, his face a mask of concern. "Dwyer attacked, my heavens. Are you all right? Miss Finch?" "We are fine," Eleanor snapped. "But this woman is not. They are trying to silence the witnesses." Bram looked confused. Witnesses to what?" "To the evidence," Eleanor said, her voice rising. "The chest, the forged deeds, The county seal! Bram shook his head, his expression full of pity. Miss Finch Eleanor, you have been through a terrible ordeal. The storm finding that boy. It must have been a great shock. What are you talking about? Eleanor demanded. There was no chest, he said, his voice gentle, patronizing. You and Mr. Redhawk brought the boy here. You were suffering from exposure. You were talking well. You were not making much sense about conspiracies. I put it down to the heat and the fear. Eleanor felt the floor drop out from under her. He was not just lying. He was erasing. He was making her a hysteric. No, we brought it here. I put it on this floor. I showed you the seal. Bram sighed. I sent a telegraph to your uncle's office in Cheyenne after you left, asking for guidance. You seemed so distressed. I was worried for you, I assure you. There was no chest. There is no conspiracy. Clay Dwyer is a respectable agent for the railroad. It was then that Eleanor understood. She was not just a tool. She was the alibi. She was the moral shield. Her presence, her known integrity, her work as a cartographer, it was all being twisted. She was Silas Finch's good niece, the one who had surveyed the land. Her signature would be the final, legal stamp on the theft, and any word she spoke against it would be dismissed as the rambling of a woman overwrought by the harshness of the frontier. She turned and looked at Tiva. He had not said a word. He was simply watching Bram, his eyes flat and knowing. He had expected this. Eleanor walked out of the office. Tiva followed, supporting Wiyaka, who was close to fainting. Ampa clung to his mother's good hand. They stood on the boardwalk, the morning sun now fully up. The town was awake, and they were utterly, completely alone. Tiva said, "We need supplies." They went to the general store. Eleanor walked to the counter. The proprietor, Mr. Hames, smiled at her. "Morning, Miss Finch." "I need bandages," Eleanor said, "and laudanum, and food, dried meat, beans, coffee, enough for 3 days." Her voice was hard, clear. Hames gathered the items. "Put it on the Finch and Partners account." Eleanor said. She was using the name, perhaps for the last time. As they packed the supplies onto her mule, she saw them. At the far end of the street, where the town dissolved back into prairie, 4 riders sat on their horses. They were not moving. They were just watching. One of them, a big man on a black horse, spat a stream of tobacco. "Clay Dwyer." Tiva finished securing the packs. He handed the reins of Eleanor's horse to her. "Where are we going?" Eleanor asked, her voice low. "Council Hill. It is the gathering place for the Cheyenne elders. Wiyaka and Ampa will be safe there, and they will be witnesses." "You are bringing them to your people." "They are witnesses," he repeated. "The truth needs a safe place." He helped Wiyaka onto his own horse, then swung up behind her, taking the reins. Ampa rode on Eleanor's horse, seated in front of her. They rode out of Larkspur Bend, not looking back. The 4 riders at the end of the street did not move to stop them. They simply watched them go. Then, slowly, they began to follow. Tiva did not take the main trail. He cut north into the broken land, a maze of dry washes and steep, rocky hills. He was pushing the horses hard, but Wiyaka was weakening, slumping against him. The pursuit was not fast. It was methodical. Dwyer was not trying to catch them. He was herding them. By afternoon, the terrain grew worse. Tiva led them into a narrow canyon, the walls rising sheer on both sides. The air was close. "We are trapped," Eleanor said, looking at the rock walls. "We are hidden," Tiva replied. But as they rounded a sharp bend, the canyon ended. A deep, wide chasm cut across the land, 100 feet deep. The only way across was a narrow, rotting bridge, built by prospectors years ago and abandoned. Timbers were missing. The ropes looked frayed. Tiva dismounted. He inspected the bridge. "It will hold," he said, "one at a time. Go." Eleanor looked at the drop. She took a breath and led her horse, with Ampa, onto the groaning timbers. The horse's hooves punched through a rotten plank, but she pulled it forward, whispering, and made it to the other side. Tiva was next. He carried Wiyaka in his arms and walked across, his steps light. Sure, he did not look down. He set her down gently and went back for his horse. That was when the riders appeared. Clay Dwyer and 6 men. They were at the mouth of the canyon, not 200 yards away. Clay raised his rifle. "Hold it! Red Hawk!" Tiva did not stop. He grabbed his horse's bridle. Clay fired. The shot was not a warning. The bullet splintered the wood at Tiva's feet. Tiva yanked his horse onto the bridge. The Black Sash spurred their horses, charging down the canyon. Tiva ran across the bridge, pulling his horse, the animal screaming in terror. Bullets snapped past his head. He reached the other side. He shoved his horse toward Eleanor. "Keep them moving." He did not run. He unslung his rifle, knelt behind a rock, and took aim. Eleanor watched, her heart in her throat. Dwyer and his men were at the bridgehead, dismounting. Tiva fired. The shot was loud, echoing in the chasm. He did not hit a man. He hit the heavy support rope on the far side of the bridge. The rope snapped, and the bridge sagged violently. Another man tried to step onto it. Tiva fired again. This time, the bullet kicked up dust a foot in front of the man's boot. The man jumped back. Clay Dwyer roared in anger. He fired, but Tiva was protected. Tiva fired a third time, at the other support. The timber splintered. The bridge groaned, twisted, and half of it tore away, collapsing into the chasm below. The pursuit was over. Tiva slung his rifle. He did not look back at the furious, stranded men. He simply walked to his horse. They rode for another hour. The sky, which had been clear, turned a metallic gray. A cold, miserable rain began to fall. Wiyaka was shivering, her face slick with sweat and rain. Tiva found shelter, a deep overhang of rock, a shallow cave hollowed out by wind and time. It was dry. He built a small, smokeless fire from dry brush he found deep under the ledge. They huddled around it, the rain a curtain of gray in front of them. Eleanor unpacked the bandages. Her hands were shaking. She had scraped them raw on the bridge, gripping the ropes. One cut on her palm was bleeding steadily. Next to her, Tiva was tending to Wiyaka, cleaning the wound with whiskey from a small flask, his movements economical and precise. Eleanor tried to wrap her own hand, but her fingers were numb with cold, and the bandage kept slipping in the blood. She cursed under her breath. Tiva finished with Wiyaka, covering her with his blanket. He looked at Eleanor. He saw her fumbling. He moved to her side. He did not ask. He took the bandage and her canteen. He gently took her hand. His grip was firm. He poured a little water over the cut, washing away the grit. His hands were large, calloused from rains and rifles, yet his touch was surprisingly gentle. He folded a piece of linen into a pad, pressed it against the cut, and began to wrap the bandage, his work neat and tight. Eleanor watched his dark head, bent over her hand. The rain drummed outside the cave. Ampa was asleep, his head in his mother's lap. She said, her voice barely a whisper, "Thank you." Tiva finished the knot and released her hand. "You were bleeding," he said. "A simple statement of fact." She looked at her wrapped hand. "This morning in Bram's office, I finally understood. They sent me here to fail. They sent me here to be their proof. My name. The name is not the person," Tiva said, his voice quiet. She looked at him, at this man who had saved her, saved a Lakota woman, and protected a child, all while being hunted by men who worked for her family. "I am standing against my family," she said. The words tasted strange, like iron. Tiva looked out at the rain. He fed a stick to the fire. It was a choice. Eleanor pulled her knees to her chest. "What happens at Council Hill?" We tell the truth. They will not believe me, she said, bitterness in her voice. My name is Finch. Tiva turned his head, his gaze meeting hers in the firelight. We go to council. We speak the truth. It does not matter how heavy the name Finch is. The truth has its own weight. The rain stopped just before dawn, leaving the air washed clean and cold. They rode east, away from the chasm. Tiva navigating the broken land with an instinct Eleanor had come to trust as much as her own compass. Uyaka was weak but resolute, and her son Ampa rode silently, his eyes fixed on Tiva's back. Council Hill was not a hill, but a high, flat mesa that rose from the prairie, its sides ringed with sandstone hoodoos that looked like silent watchers. It was a place of power, a place for solemn words. As they approached, 2 Cheyenne sentries stepped out from the rocks, their rifles held ready. Tiva spoke to them, his voice low and carrying. He used his own name. The rifles were lowered. They were led into a modest camp, lodges scattered among the sparse pines. This was not a war camp. It was a sanctuary. Women and old men emerged, their faces creased with worry. Uyaka and Ampa were taken immediately, gentle hands guiding them toward a lodge where a healer waited. An elder approached, his face a map of long years and deep thought. His hair was gray, braided with otter fur. He was Navi. His eyes were not hostile, but they were heavy, weighted with the burden of leadership. He looked at Tiva, and then his gaze settled on Eleanor. It was a look that stripped away her name, her clothes, her intentions, leaving only the truth of her. Tiva spoke for a long time. He told of the marker, the storm, the chest, the seal. He told of Bram's lie and of the attack on the Lakota camp. Navi listened without interruption. When Tiva finished, the elder nodded slowly. He called for a council. They gathered in the open, under the vast, clean sky. There was no grand hall, only the circle of the people. Navi sat, and the other elders joined him. Uyaka was brought, her arm bandaged, her son beside her. She spoke, her voice thin but clear. She told of the attack, and then she told of something else. She said, 2 nights passed. I went to the Javelina Saloon in Larkspur Bend to trade. I used the back door. I saw Marshal Bram. He was with the man they call Clay Dwyer. The big man gave the marshal a heavy canvas bag. The marshal said, Silas will be pleased. The pressure is working. A murmur went through the crowd. Bram, the agent of the white man's law, was a paid man. Then, Navi looked at Eleanor, the woman with the name of the enemy. Eleanor's hands were shaking. Her wrapped palm throbbed. This was it, the choice. She was no longer a cartographer. She was a witness. She stepped forward and unrolled her map, the true one, on a flat stone in the center of the circle. My name is Eleanor Finch, she said, her voice clear. My uncle is Silas Finch. She paused, letting the name settle. He hired me to survey this land. This is my map, drawn from the county records and my own measurements. According to this, the boundary line is the creek. She pointed. Yesterday, Tiva Redhawk and I found new markers, stakes, carved with my family's name. They are 1 mile north of the creek. They are on this land. She looked at Navi. Your land. My map is the truth. The stakes in the ground are a lie. A heavy silence followed. She had spoken against her own blood. Navi studied the map. He looked at the lines she had drawn, the precise degrees, the meticulous notation. He then spoke to 2 of the men. Bring the stones. They brought flat, painted stones, etched with symbols. It was a map, but of a different kind. It showed rivers, buttes, and the paths of the herds. Navi laid a long, straight rod across Eleanor's map, aligning it with the creek. Then he laid it across his own people's map. The lines agreed. He then pointed to a spot on the prairie, far to the south. The ancestors placed a marker there, a pile of stones. Blessed, it marks the edge of the great herd's path. The fence your uncle builds it runs through the center of that path. He looked at Eleanor. Your paper truth and our stone truth are the same. Your family builds its fences on a lie. Eleanor felt a strange, cold relief. She had chosen. She had left her family and stepped onto this small, windswept circle of truth. The name Finch was still hers, but it felt like a coat she was preparing to shed. But what now? Tiva asked Navi. The lie is strong. Bram has the chest. He has the seal. He has the power of the town. He will use it soon, Eleanor said, thinking aloud. Larkspur Bend is having its market day in 3 days. The district judge comes. That is when Silas will present the new deeds. That is when he will use the forged seal to make the thefts legal. Then we must have the chest before then, Tiva said. How a young warrior named Two Elks challenged. Bram keeps it in his safe. We would have to fight the whole town. Before Tiva could answer, a rider came into the camp. His horse lathered. He was a young Cheyenne who'd been watching the town. He ran to Tiva. They have Kohia, he said, his voice tight with anger. Tiva's body went rigid. His cousin, the boy he had been trying to free. Bram arrested him again. This morning, after we left, they say he was resisting. They have him in the cell. Tiva's face was stone, but Eleanor saw the muscle jump in his jaw. The trap was closing. And there is a message. The rider said, from Bram. He gave it to a homesteader. Who gave it to me? He said Tiva Redhawk would understand. What is the message? Navi asked. A quiet trade. The boy for the map. And silence. Silence. Kohia's freedom in exchange for the lives and lands of everyone on the mesa. In exchange for the truth. Tiva closed his eyes. It was a cruel, perfect move. We must attack, Two Elks said, his hand on his knife. We ride now. We free Kohia. We burn the marshal's office. A few other young men voiced their agreement. Blood for blood. No, Tiva said, his voice low and sharp. That is what they want. We ride in. They call it an uprising. They will have the cavalry here in a week. We will lose Kohia, and we will lose the land. It is a fool's path. Then what is the wise path? Tiva Two Elks sneered. Do we let them hold the boy while we talk? Tiva looked at Eleanor. His mind was working. Seeing the pieces. Bram, Clay, Kohia, the chest. Bram is a coward. Tiva said he is afraid of the chest. He would not destroy it, because it is his only proof against Clay. Should Silas decide to betray him, he is holding it. But he will not hold it in his office if he thinks we will attack. He will give it to Clay, and Clay will not keep it in town, Eleanor added, catching his logic. He will send it to Silas, to be ready for the judge. They have to move it, Tiva said. They would move it tonight, under darkness. They would move it to a place they think is safe. Eleanor said, we need to know where. Tiva looked at her. There is one place, the Javelina Saloon. It is where Clay Dwyer drinks. It is where he talks. It was insane to go back to the town that was hunting them. I will go, Tiva said. No, Eleanor said, I will. They are looking for you. I am just the distressed niece. Tiva shook his head. Clay knows you. You were at the camp. Then we go together. She said, you know the shadows. I know the voices. Night fell thick and moonless. They left their horses a mile out and approached Larkspur Bend on foot, moving through the same dry creek bed they had camped in. The town was loud. Music and rough laughter spilled from the javelina. Tiva moved like smoke. He led Eleanor to the alley behind the saloon, a narrow space choked with barrels and refuse. The back window was propped open a few inches, letting out a sliver of yellow light and the stink of stale whiskey. They crouched in the dark, just below the sill. Inside, they heard Clay Dwyer's voice. It was a loud, bragging sound. Bram is scared colorless. He laughed. He thinks that Cheyenne Warrior is going to come for him. He wanted me to take the whole box. Another voice, smoother. And did you? Dwyer laughed again. I took what matters. The seal is in my pocket. The box of papers is just paper. I am sending it ahead. The boss wants it at the Red Gate Pass crossing tomorrow by noon. The stage will pick it up there. It is safer than bringing it to the judge here. The stage it is on the transport wagon. My best 2 men are guarding it. It is already locked and loaded, hidden under the tarps. It leaves at dawn. And the boy Dwyer's voice turned cold. The boy stays in the cell. He is the insurance. If the girl and her redskin guide show up, the deal is honored. If they do not, the boy has an accident. Simple. Eleanor pressed her back against the wall, her heart sick. Tiva put a hand on her arm, a signal for silence. They backed away, melting into the shadows, and were gone. They were back at Council Hill before the first hint of morning. The camp was quiet, the fire's low embers. Tiva gathered the elders and the young warriors, including 2 elks. He told them what they had heard. The chest will be on a wagon. It leaves at dawn. It will be at Red Gate Pass by noon. It will be guarded. "This is our chance," Tiva said. "Not to fight, to be smart." 2 elks spat. "While Kohia sits in a cell, we get the chest," Tiva said, his voice hard. "We get the proof. The chest is the key. When we have it, Bram has no more power. Clay has no more power. Kohia will be free. Attacking the town now saves no one." The young warrior looked mutinous, but the logic was sound. How, he demanded, "The route. A stage route. Red Gate Pass. Eleanor, she is a map maker. She knows the terrain." Eleanor stepped forward. "The pass is narrow. The road is bad. A wagon will be slow. There is a blind curve just before the crossing." Tiva nodded. "We do not stop them with bullets. We stop them with horses. We create a diversion. We take the chest. No one is harmed. It is the only way." Navi had been listening, his eyes closed. He opened them and looked at Tiva. He approved. He held out his hand. He pressed a small leather pouch into Tiva's palm. It was an amulet, filled with sacred herbs and tied with a leather thong. The elder's voice was soft. "This holds the prayers of our grandmothers. You are a warrior, Tiva. But this is not a war for hatred. Carry the words of the living and the lost on the wind. Not the anger. Bring back the truth." Tiva closed his hand around the amulet. He secured it around his neck, tucking it inside his shirt. He looked at Eleanor. It was time to ride. Red Gate Pass was a wound in the earth, a narrow slit where the rock walls rose sheer and smooth. Eleanor Finch had chosen the spot herself. She stood concealed in a high alcove with Tiva Redhawk, looking down at the blind curve in the wagon road. Her map had told her this was the place, the acoustics of the rock. She had explained, would amplify the sound, making a small herd seem like a stampede. Tiva nodded, his hand resting on the warm leather of the amulet Navi had given him. Below, hidden in a tangle of brush, 2 elks and 3 other Cheyenne warriors waited with a small, restless herd of 20 horses. This was not a plan of war. It was a plan of wits, a theft born of necessity. They would not use guns. They would use the land itself. They waited. The high, thin silence of the prairie stretched, pulled tight like a drum skin. Eleanor could feel her own pulse, a steady, anxious beat. Tiva was still, his gaze fixed on the entrance to the pass. He was a piece of the rock, patient and absolute. The sound came, faint at first, then growing, the clatter of harnesses, the grating of iron wagon wheels, the low curse of a driver, a heavy transport wagon, the kind used for freight, lumbered into view. It was pulled by 4 heavy mules. 2 men sat on the driver's bench, 2 more rode as guards, 1 in front, 1 lagging behind. 4 men, their rifles held casual across their saddles. Tiva raised his hand, a silent signal. "Down below!" 2 elks gave a sharp cry. The Cheyenne warriors drove the small herd of horses from the brush, straight onto the wagon road. It was an avalanche of panic. The horses, yelling, poured around the blind curve. The lead guard's horse screamed and reared. Throwing him, the wagon driver hauled back on the reins. his own voice roaring. The mules braying in terror as the wagon skidded sideways, blocking the pass. The rear guard was engulfed, his horse turning and fleeing, lost in the chaotic, dust-choked herd. In that precise moment of confusion, Tiva and Eleanor moved. They rode down the steep embankment, not with the stampede, but behind it. The two drivers on the wagon were fighting the terrified mules. The one guard who remained was trying to calm his horse. Tiva left his own horse, leaping onto the back of the wagon in one fluid motion. He carried no rifle, only his knife. He did not go for the men. He slashed the ropes holding the heavy canvas tarp. Eleanor rode her horse alongside the lurching wagon, her face set. She kept her mount steady, her leg pressed against the spinning wooden wheel. The driver, a big man with a pistol tucked in his belt, finally saw Tiva. He fumbled for the weapon. Tiva had the tarp clear. He saw the chest, the small, dark, iron-bound box. He did not hesitate. He grabbed it, swinging it by its handle. He did not aim for the man's head. He swung the heavy box hard against the man's shoulder and arm. The man howled, his pistol clattering to the floorboards. Tiva lifted the chest. He looked at Eleanor. Catch. He threw it. Eleanor leaned far out of her saddle, catching the heavy weight against her body. It almost pulled her from her horse, but she gripped it, finding her balance, securing it against her saddle horn. Tiva leaped, not to the ground, but to the back of his own horse, which Eleanor had led alongside. They were gone. They spurred their horses, scrambling back up the rocky slope, disappearing into the maze of hoodoos just as two elks and the others drove the last of the stampeding horses away in the opposite direction. The wagon was left in disarray, its guards shouting in the dust. They rode for miles, pushing hard, until they were deep in the Badlands. They found shelter in a dry wash, the air still and hot. Eleanor slid from her horse, her arms aching from the weight of the chest. She let it fall to the ground. Tiva was beside her, his rifle ready, scanning their back trail. He saw nothing. He turned to the chest. He did not have the key. He used a heavy, sharp stone, smashing the lock again and again until the wood splintered and the metal gave way. He threw the lid open. Inside lay the papers, the stacks of blank deeds, the ledger with the list of homesteaders. He ran his hand over them, a brief look of triumph on his face. Then he stopped. He dug through the papers, tossing them out onto the sand. He ran his fingers along the empty, wooden bottom of the chest. His face went flat. Eleanor knelt beside him. "What is it? What is wrong?" He looked up, his eyes dark. "It is not here." "What is not here?" He turned the box over, shaking it. "Nothing." "The seal," he said. "The heavy steel." Clay Dwyer did not lie in the saloon. He took it, he sent the papers, but he kept the weapon. Eleanor sat back on her heels. The truth felt like ash in her mouth. They had the evidence of the plan, but not the tool of the crime. Without the seal, it was just their word, a stack of blank paper, against the power of Silas Finch. It was a victory, but it was hollow. They returned to Council Hill. The mood was somber. They had the papers, but Kohea was still in his cell. The victory felt thin. A rider was waiting for them. It was the nervous homesteader, Peters. He had been watching the town. He held a yellow telegraph envelope. "It came for you, Miss Finch. Marshal Bram sent it out. He said you would be here." Eleanor's hands were steady as she took it. She tore it open. The transcribed message was brief, the words like cold iron. "Come home. Stop playing games. Leave those savages. You are a Finch." It was from Silas. The word savages was a blade, meant to cut her away from Tiva, from Navi, from the truth she had found. She turned to the homesteader. He looked terrified to be there. "Will you take a message back to the telegraph office?" He hesitated. She took a gold coin, one of the few she had left, from her pocket. "For your trouble." The man looked at the coin, then at her. He nodded. She borrowed his pencil and a scrap of paper from his pocket ledger. She wrote, her hand firm. She did not sign it. He would know who it was from. She handed the message to the man. It said, "I will return. I will ask why you value land more than honor." The next day was a heavy, suffocating stillness. It was the day before the market. The judge was expected in Larkspur Bend. The town was filling up. Peters returned in the evening, his face drawn. He brought no reply from Silas. He brought news. He said the First Baptist Church had been full to bursting. Pastor Jerome had preached a powerful sermon. He had spoken of divine order. He had called the new fences and the railroad the work of progress, a sacred duty to tame the wild. He had blessed the name of Finch and Partners. And more, the pressure was working. 2 families, the Horns and the Cartwrights, whose names were on the list in the chest, had been evicted from their homesteads that morning. The Black Sash had been there, but it was Marshal Bram who had served the papers. The law was working fast. That night, the mood on the mesa was grim. The people were trapped, their land shrinking, their bargaining chip, Cohia, still imprisoned. Eleanor found herself sitting by a small fire. The children were gathered around, their faces anxious. Ampa, the Lakota boy, watched her as she made notes in her journal. He pointed to the pencil. She looked at his small, curious face. She found a piece of flat, smooth bark and a stick of charcoal from the fire. She drew a letter. A. Soon. 3. Then 5 children were gathered around, Lakota and Cheyenne. They sat in the firelight, their faces serious, trying to copy the strange, powerful marks. Tiva sat nearby, repairing a bridle. He watched her. The anger and the tension seemed to fall away from him. He saw the teacher she was, Navi, his arm in a sling where he had been grazed in the first attack. Sat with him. Tiva began to speak, his voice low. Not for Eleanor, but for the children, for the elders. He told a story. It was not a story of war. It was the story of the last great buffalo hunt. Before the fences, he spoke of the sound of the herd, a sound like thunder that came from the earth. He spoke of the respect given to the animals, of the prayers said. He was preserving a world that was being erased by the very progress Pastor Jerome had preached about. Eleanor listened, her hand still. She was teaching them the white man's letters. He was teaching them their own memory, the trust between them. Born in the storm, hardened in the chase, was now something more. It was a shared, quiet understanding, a space where 2 worlds touched without colliding. The attack came in the deepest part of the night, the hour just before dawn when the soul is at its lowest. A scream cut the air. A sentry. This time, the Black Sash did not ride in. They had climbed the steep sides of the mesa on foot, silent as snakes. Fire exploded. A lodge burst into flames. The night shattered with gunshots. Tiva was on his feet, his rifle in his hand. He shoved Eleanor behind a stack of curing hides. Warriors, 2 elks among them, scrambled from their blankets, returning fire. It was chaos, smoke, and terror. Navi emerged from his lodge, holding an old rifle. A member of the Black Sash, a large man on a black horse who must have found the trail. Fired from the darkness. Navi spun, clutching his shoulder, and fell. Tiva saw him go down. He ran toward the elder, firing, his rifle spitting flame. It was a diversion. From the smoke to his left, 3 men burst forth. It was not the Black Sash. It was Marshal Bram, his face pale and sweating, flanked by 2 deputies. They were not aiming for Tiva. They grabbed Eleanor. Bram twisted her arm behind her back, jamming the barrel of his pistol against her temple. "Stop!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "Everybody stop!" The fighting sputtered and died. Clay Dwyer stepped out of the smoke, a wide grin on his face. Bram held Eleanor as a shield. "Tiva, Red Hawk, it is over. Drop the rifle." Tiva stood in the open, the smoke burning his lungs. He saw Navi on the ground, wounded. He saw Eleanor, held captive. This was the final choice. blood, or wits. "Let her go, Bram," Tiva said, his voice a low, dangerous calm. "Drop it," Bram screamed. Tiva let the rifle fall to the dust. Clay Dwyer laughed. A short, ugly bark. "Well, look at the brave warrior." "You do not want her," Tiva said, walking forward slowly. "You want me. I took the chest. I know the truth. Let her go, and you can take me." "Tiva, no!" Eleanor screamed, struggling against Bram's grip. Bram looked at Clay, his eyes wide with fear. Clay nodded. "A good trade." "You give yourself up, Tiva," Bram said, his voice regaining a little of its official bluster. "For her, and you promise. No more attacks, no more trouble." Tiva looked at Eleanor. He spoke past Bram. His words meant only for her. Clear across the smoldering clearing, "I promise, everyone will be safe." He raised his hands. Bram shoved Eleanor so hard she fell to her knees. The deputies swarmed Tiva, tying his hands behind his back with cruel, tight knots. Clay Dwyer walked over to the fire. He saw the chest of papers they had stolen. He picked it up, tucking it under his arm. He had the papers, he had the warrior, and he still had the seal. Eleanor scrambled to her feet and ran to Navi. The wound was high on his shoulder. It was bloody, but he was alive. She watched, helpless, as they dragged Tiva away. They put him on a horse, bound and defeated, and led him down the path, back toward Larkspur Bend. The sun was beginning to touch the horizon. It was the morning of the market day. The judge would be arriving. They did not put Tiva in the cell. They threw him into the dark, foul-smelling stable behind the marshal's office, a place of rot and discarded junk. He was alone in the dark, the heavy bar falling on the outside of the door. The town, just waking up, was preparing for the triumph of the law. Eleanor was not taken to a cell. She was escorted, with a cold, false courtesy, to the private parlor above the Javelina saloon, which her uncle, Silas Finch, had commandeered as his own. The room was thick with cigar smoke and the smell of expensive whiskey. Silas stood by the window, a man whose wealth was a physical presence, a weight in the room. He was not a frontier ruffian. He was a businessman, dressed in a fine Eastern suit. He turned, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. "Eleanor, you have caused me a great deal of trouble. I came here to do a job, Uncle, to map the land. I found a theft." Silas smiled, a thin, dry expression. "You found progress. My dear, you are confusing morality with engineering. The railroad is a great, cleansing fire. It burns away the old to make way for the new. It is the engine of civilization. And your civilization is built on lies, on attacking sleeping camps, on jailing children." Eleanor's voice was low, shaking with a coldness that matched his. He waved a dismissive hand. "Details, unfortunate, but necessary. Do you know what those lines on your little maps are? They are promises, not to the men who are, but to the men who will be. They are the framework for a nation. I am building a nation. These natives, these backward homesteaders, they are standing in the way of history." She met his gaze. "You are standing in the way of honor. You are using my name, the name our family built, to cover your crimes." "That is where you are mistaken," Silas said, setting down his glass. He walked to the desk. Marshal Bram entered, his face pale. He was carrying a rolled map and a heavy, steel object. Silas unrolled the map. It was not her original. It was a new, pristine copy, showing the altered boundaries, the stolen mile of water, the land taken from the Cheyenne. Silas took the steel seal from Bram. "This," he said, "is all that matters. The court does not listen to the stars. Eleanor, it does not care about astronomical discrepancies or old stone piles. It listens to this. It listens to the stamp of authority." He held it out, the official seal of Fremont County. Bram also carried her cartographer's satchel, the one they had taken from her on the mesa. He placed it on the table. "Here is the bargain," Silas said. "Your warrior friend is in the stable. His cousin is in the cell. They are both expendable. You, however, are not. You will sign this map. You will stand beside me in the square and verify its authenticity. And if I refuse—" Silas nodded to Bram. The marshal would not meet her eyes. "Tiva will be tried for the murder of the men at Red Gate Pass, the ones who so conveniently disappeared in the chasm. They were not murdered. Tiva shot the bridge." Eleanor choked on the words. "A judge will hear my version," Silas said, "and he will believe the seal. Now, you will sign, and Tiva will be released. A simple trade." Eleanor looked at the map. She looked at the seal in her uncle's hand. She felt the weight of Tiva's life, of Kohia's. She had only one path. "Very well," she said, her voice flat. Silas smiled. "I knew you were a practical girl. But my hand is shaking. I will not sign with that crude office pen. It will look like a forgery. I must use my own drafting pen, and my own ink. It is in my satchel." Silas nodded. "Indulge her. Bram." Bram pushed the satchel toward her. Eleanor opened it. Her hands moved, finding her familiar tools, the brass pen, a blotter, and a small, dark blue bottle of pigment. It was a special ink, a deep, permanent cerulean she used for marking water features. She uncapped the bottle, her movements deliberately clumsy. She set up the inkwell. As she reached for the pen, her elbow accidentally struck the bottle. It tipped, a wave of vivid blue ink spilling across the desk. Silas roared. "You fool, you clumsy! Useless!" He lunged, trying to save the map from the spill. "Oh, Uncle, I am so sorry," Eleanor cried, grabbing for his hand. "Do not let it stain the map." Her hand, wet with the ink, clamped down on his. She pressed her thumb, saturated with the blue pigment, hard into his palm. Silas snatched his hand back, his face a mask of fury. There was a perfect dark blue stain, a map of her thumbprint, in the center of his right hand. He was so enraged he did not see the true purpose, only the mess. "Get out!" he shouted, blotting the ink with his sleeve, smearing it. "Get out and clean yourself. The hearing is in 1 hour. You will be in the square. You will sign it then, in front of everyone. If I have to guide your hand myself." She did not need to be told twice. She grabbed her satchel and fled the room. She did not go to her hotel room. She ran down the back stairs, into the alley, and straight to the marshal's office. It was, as she had guessed, nearly empty. One deputy sat on a chair, tilted back, guarding the cell block. Kohia was visible inside, his face pressed to the bars. Eleanor walked in, her face a mask of frantic distress. "Deputy, please, my uncle, he is furious. He spilled ink. I need water, a cloth, please." The deputy, recognizing her, stood up, annoyed. "Miss Finch, I am on." She stumbled, tripping over her own satchel. A small, glass vial flew from her bag and shattered on his hand. The deputy screamed, a high, thin sound. He clutched his hand, where the liquid, a mild nitric acid she used for etching plates, was smoking faintly on his skin. It burns." While he was doubled over, howling, Eleanor ran past him. The padlock on Kohia's cell was heavy and old. She took the larger, corked bottle of the same acid from her satchel. She poured it directly into the lock mechanism. The metal hissed, a plume of acrid smoke rising. Kohia, his eyes wide, threw his shoulder against the door. With a groan of tortured metal, the hasp broke. She grabbed his hand. "Now." They ran, out the back door, to the stable. It was dark, smelling of manure and fear. "Tiva!" He was in the last stall, bound. Kohia, small and quick, slid under the heavy bar. He used his teeth and fingers to untie the knots on Tiva's hands. A shout came from the marshal's office. The alarm had been raised. Tiva was free. He did not pause. He pushed the heavy bar up. The three of them burst out of the stable. Just as the sky opened, A cold, violent rain began to fall, turning the dust of the alley into a slick, ankle-deep mud. Clay Dwyer. The shout came from the end of the alley. Dwyer and two black sash men were there, blocking the way to the street. The three of them turned, running the other way, toward the open prairie, toward the Red Gate Pass. It was a desperate, slipping chase. Clay and his men were on foot, running hard. The mud was treacherous. Eleanor fell, and Tiva pulled her up. One of the black sash men, a heavy brute, lunged, grabbing for Kohia. The boy ducked. The man's boots hit a patch of spilled garbage and mud. His feet went out from under him. He did not fall from a cliff. He crashed headlong into a stack of empty barrels, his head hitting the wood with a sickening crack. He lay still, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. Clay Dwyer stopped to look at his fallen man, roaring in fury. That hesitation was all they needed. Tiva, Eleanor, and Kohea burst from the mouth of the alley. They did not run from the town. They ran to it. The town square was a sea of people, huddled under the sudden, driving rain. Farmers, ranchers, shopkeepers, and the newly arrived district judge, a stern man in a black coat, were all gathered under the partial shelter of the hotel awning, where the hearing was about to begin. They were 100 feet away. They stopped, gasping for breath, soaked to the bone. Tiva looked at Eleanor. The rain streamed down his face. He reached inside his shirt and pulled out the small leather amulet Navi had given him. It was dark with sweat and rain. He did not put it on her. He pressed it into her hand, closing her fingers around it. He said, Navi said to carry the words of the living and the lost, not anger. He looked from the amulet to her eyes, to the crowd waiting for justice. Carry my words. Eleanor, if I fall, you speak. He did not wait for an answer. He began to walk, straight toward the judge, toward Clay Dwyer, and toward Silas Finch, who was just now stepping onto the porch, his hand scrubbed red, but the blue stain still visible in the creases of his palm. As Eleanor stood in the drenching rain, the town square a blur of hostile faces. The weight of the leather amulet Tiva had just pressed into her hand was the only solid thing in the world. Its damp warmth against her cold palm was a shock, a sudden, sharp anchor. Her mind, reeling from the chase and the acid, flashed back. It was not to the stable, or to her uncle's room. It was to another night, another rain, just 2 nights past. It was after the wagon heist, after they had discovered the steel seal was missing. They had made a cold camp in a shallow dell, miles from Council Hill, knowing they were hunted, knowing their victory was only half complete. Kohea was still in his cell. Tiva was still a marked man. A cold, steady rain had begun to fall, a precursor to the storm that now soaked them. They had a single, small shelter, a lean-to of canvas Eleanor had brought, barely large enough for 2 people to sit, let alone lie down. The fire was small, a handful of embers that fought against the damp. They sat side by side, not touching, but the small space forced an awareness, a closeness that was heavier than the humid air. The rain drummed on the canvas, a relentless, quiet rhythm, like 1,000 fingers tapping. They were both grown, both adults, and both stripped down to the raw nerve of their purpose. The professional distance of their first ride had been burned away by shared danger, by Bram's betrayal, by the attack on the mesa. Eleanor was huddled, her knees drawn up, staring at the weak, glowing embers. She had never felt so far from the person she had been. The lines on her maps, the certainties of her old life, they were all gone, replaced by this man, this cause, this terrible, clarifying fight. She was aware of his breathing next to her, the steady, calm rhythm of it. He was a man of profound stillness, and in the small, dark tent, that stillness was a living thing. She turned her head. He was watching her, not with the assessing gaze of a guide, or the cold calculation of a warrior. He was simply looking at her, his eyes, in the faint red glow of the coals, held an intensity that was open, unguarded, and deeply human. It was a look that saw past the Finch name, past the frightened teacher, and saw the woman who had stood with him. The look held, and a slow, deep blush rose from her throat. Warming her face against the cold, she felt suddenly, strangely vulnerable, as if he could see every doubt and every fear she had. She looked away, at the canvas wall, her voice barely a whisper. "Don't look at me like that." A long moment passed, filled only by the sound of the rain. Then, his voice, low and close in the darkness. "Hard not to." She turned back. His face was very near. He was not smiling, not in the way of humor. It was a faint, almost sad lifting of the corners of his mouth. He said, "You're my virgin angel." The words were strange, from another world. She did not understand them. "My what?" He reached out, not to hold her, but to trace the line of her jaw with the back of one finger, his touch rough and impossibly gentle. From a story my grandmother told, of a spirit, a sky woman, who fell to earth. She was lost, and she carried the truth in her heart, and she did not know she was an angel. Eleanor felt a tightness in her chest. "Tiva, His finger touched her lips, hushing her. "I know who you are. Eleanor Finch. You are the one who spoke the truth when your own name was a lie." He leaned in, the narrative of their lives, of Cheyenne and White, of land and paper, of pursuer and pursued. All fell away. There was only the rain, the darkness, and the profound, undeniable truth of the moment. He was not a warrior. She was not a Finch. They were a man and a woman, driven to the same small point of existence. He touched her hand, the one that had been wrapped. His hand closed over hers, his thumb rubbing the back of her palm. It was a promise, a simple, physical vow. The story of what happened next was not for the world. It was theirs. It was a quiet, consenting touch, a meeting of two people who had seen the worst of each other's worlds and had chosen to stand together. It was a shared breath in the dark, a promise spoken without words. It was a moment of profound, gentle peace before the final battle, a shelter from the storm. The sound of the rain on the canvas was the only witness as the embers faded to black, and in the small, dark tent, two enemies of circumstance found a single, shared truth. Later, in the gray light just before dawn, they lay awake, the rain still falling. The world was waiting for them. Eleanor turned to him. The shyness was gone, replaced by the same cold clarity she had felt when she first saw the forged marker. She was no longer afraid of her name. It was just a word. He had given her a new one. Tiva looked at her, his mind already turning to the day ahead. He felt a shift in his own spirit. He was not just fighting for his people, for the land, for the memory of the buffalo. He was fighting for her. He had been chosen, not just by duty, but by her. "We will need a plan," she said, her voice practical, but with a new, steel undertone, a legal plan. He nodded. "The judge will not listen to our words." "No," she said, her mind, the cartographer's mind, seeing the pieces. "He will not listen to words, but he will look at evidence. Clay has the seal." "But we have nothing to prove it is the one," Tiva said. Eleanor was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "We do not need to prove it. We just need to mark it. Like a map, I have an idea. We need to get your uncle to hold the seal. We need to make him stain his own hand." And as they spoke, laying the groundwork for the desperate, improbable plan of ink and acid, a new, unexpected ally was riding into Larkspur Bend, Marisol, the owner of the Javelina Saloon. A woman who saw everything and said nothing, was carrying a heavy, leather-bound ledger. It was her book of accounts, a detailed, secret record of every bribe, every free drink, and every canvas bag of coins that had passed from Clay Dwyer and Marshall Bram to the men of the Black Sash. In the church, as the rain began, Pastor Jerome was preparing his sermon on order, but he was stopped by his wife. a quiet woman of Osage descent who had been silent for 20 years. She looked at him, her dark eyes full of a pain he had never acknowledged, and she said, "Tell them, husband, tell them of the order that drove my people from our lands. Tell them if your God blesses that, too." The stage was set. The sky was dark with thunder. The sound of the rain on the tent was a drumbeat, a heart rising, a final, shared promise. "Tomorrow," Tiva said, his hand finding hers in the dark. Eleanor gripped it. "Tomorrow, we do not look back." The memory dissolved, as sharp and cold as the rain that was now soaking her to the bone. Eleanor looked at Tiva, standing beside her in the square, his face a mask of resolve. He had just given her the amulet. The trial was beginning. The crowd was silent. She closed her hand, the leather pouch safe inside, and she met her uncle's gaze across the square. She was not afraid. She did not look back. The rain was a cold sheet, turning the world gray. Tiva Redhawk, Eleanor Finch, and the boy Kohia walked into the town square. They were soaked, muddy from the chase, and breathing hard. They stopped before the raised hotel porch, which served as the makeshift courthouse. On the porch, Silas Finch stood, his face darkening with rage at the sight of them. Marshal Bram looked terrified, his hand twitching near his holster. Clay Dwyer, his coat slick with rain, merely grinned, seeing his quarry returned. The district judge, a man named Harlan, looked down at the trio. He was a stern man, unimpressed by the weather or the drama. "Order. I will have order." Silas stepped forward, regaining his composure. He bowed slightly to the judge. "Your Honor, my apologies for this interruption. Some local troublemakers." He turned to the table set up on the porch. He presented his file of papers, the ones taken from Tiva and Eleanor on the mesa. "Here are the certified deeds of transfer, Your Honor, signed and approved by the county, ready for your final authorization. We, Finch and partners, have legally acquired these lands for the advancement of the railroad, an act this entire territory supports." Marshal Bram, trying to find his footing, stepped forward. He put his hand on his pistol. "We have the situation under control, Your Honor. These individuals are wanted for theft, assault, and escaping custody. It is all in order." Eleanor Finch stepped forward. The rain streamed from her hair, matting it to her face. She was not shouting. Her voice was cold, clear, and carried over the sound of the storm. "That is a lie." The crowd, which had been a low murmur, went silent. Silas scoffed. "Eleanor, do not embarrass yourself." "Your Honor," Eleanor said, addressing the judge, "my name is Eleanor Finch. I am a cartographer, hired by this man, my uncle, to survey the boundary lines. He has presented you with a false map." She reached into her own satchel, the one she had retrieved from the saloon, and pulled out her original, worn, ink-stained map. "This is the true map, the one I drew according to the original county survey and my own celestial sightings. The boundary line, legally, is the Red Bluffs Creek." She pointed, not at the map, but toward the prairie. His new fences, the ones Marshal Bram is protecting, are a full mile north of that creek. He has stolen the water. He has stolen the land. A low sound moved through the homesteaders in the crowd. They knew this. They had seen the new fences. Silas laughed. "Your Honor, my niece is overwrought. She has been associating with these natives. Her judgment is compromised." Eleanor did not flinch. "My judgment is sound. My measurements are precise. The stars do not lie. The original stone markers, the ones my uncle's men dug up and moved, do not lie." "Then prove it," Silas sneered. "Prove that your map is true and mine is false. All I see is paper against paper, but I have the authority." He reached to the desk and held up the heavy, gleaming object, the Fremont County seal. "This is the law. Eleanor, this is the truth." He slammed it down on the table, next to the judge. Eleanor looked at Tiva. It was time. Tiva moved. He was not fast, not threatening. He simply walked up the 3 steps of the porch. Bram and Clay Dwyer moved to stop him. "Wait," Tiva said, his voice a low command. He looked at the judge. "He is right. The seal is the truth." Silas looked confused. Tiva looked at Silas. "You have held the seal." "Of course I have," Silas said. "It is mine to hold." Tiva reached into his own wet shirt. He did not pull out a weapon. He pulled out a folded piece of white cloth. It was Eleanor's, a handkerchief, clean, but damp. Tiva said to the judge, "Ask him to hold the seal again." "What is this nonsense?" Silas blustered. "Humor him," the judge said, his eyes narrow. Silas, annoyed, picked up the heavy steel seal, his right hand closing around it. "Now," Tiva said, "press it to the cloth." "This is a circus." "Press it, Silas," the judge commanded. Furious, Silas Finch pressed the seal into the white cloth Tiva held. Tiva pulled the cloth away. He held it up for the judge to see. There, in the center of the cloth, was a perfect dark blue impression of the county seal. The crowd gasped. Silas looked at the cloth. He looked at the seal in his hand. It was clean. It was dry steel. He did not understand. Eleanor stepped forward. "It is the ink from my desk, the ink he spilled." She held up the small, empty vial of nitric acid from her satchel. "The cloth was treated. I marked the seal when I was in his room. The same ink." She pointed, her fingers steady as a survey line. "That is still on his hand." Silas instinctively tried to hide his right hand, but the judge grabbed his wrist. He turned Silas's hand over. There, scrubbed raw but still stained deep in the creases of his palm, was the unmistakable, accusing stain of cerulean blue. "The proof." "Your Honor," Eleanor said, her voice shaking but strong. "He marked himself as the forger when he tried to hide his crime." The crowd erupted. Silas Finch, white as a ghost, tried to pull his hand back. "And I have more truth." A new voice, sharp and clear. Marisol, the owner of the Javelina, pushed through the crowd. She was holding her heavy ledger. "A man's reputation," she said, "is built on paper, his debts and his crimes. I keep the books for the Javelina. Mr. Finch and Mr. Dwyer, they paid for many things." She opened the book and laid it on the table, the pages stiff from the rain. She pointed, "Here, 3 days ago, a payment to Marshal Bram," for she read the entry, holding the chest. Bram lunged for the book. This is private." Marisol did not move. "It is the same day, Marshal, that you told Miss Finch the chest did not exist." She pointed to another entry, a payment to Clay Dwyer, for black sash services. The signature was a bold, arrogant scrawl, Clay Dwyer. The judge looked at Bram. The marshal was finished. His face had collapsed. Clay Dwyer saw it. He saw the trap, the judge, the angry faces of the homesteaders. He was not a man of law. He was a man of violence. He roared, pulling his pistol. He did not aim at Tiva. He aimed at the sky, a desperate act of chaos. He fired. The crowd screamed and fell back. In that instant, Tiva moved. He did not grab for the gun. He launched himself from the porch, hitting Clay's gun arm with his shoulder. The second shot went wild, into the mud. Clay was strong, and he brought the gun around, trying to aim it at Tiva's chest. A single shot cracked, sharp and different from Clay's pistol. Clay screamed, his pistol clattering to the wet boardwalk. He stared, stunned, at his hand. A neat, red hole had appeared through his palm. Tiva stood, breathing hard, across the square. Kohia lowered Tiva's rifle, the one he had obviously retrieved from the stable. The boy had not aimed to kill. He had aimed, as Tiva had at the bridge, to disarm. Tiva walked over to the whimpering Clay. He kicked the pistol away. He did not look at the man. A warrior does not strike a man who is defeated. Silas Finch saw his world end. His enforcer was down. His partner was exposed. His niece had destroyed him with a bottle of ink. He turned, not walking, but running, scrambling off the back of the porch, trying to get to his horse. He did not get 2 steps. The crowd of homesteaders, the ones he had called backward, closed in. They did not touch him. They simply stood, a wall of wet wool and hard faces. He was trapped. "Stop." The voice was small, but high and clear. Ampa, the Lakota boy, pushed through the crowd. He was with his mother, Wiyaka. He ran into the square and pointed, not at Silas, but at one of the black sash men standing near the defeated Clay. Him Ampa shouted, "He is the one who lit the fire. I saw his face." The man lunged, but it was too late. The townsfolk grabbed him. The judge stood. He looked at Silas, at Bram, at Clay, and at the cowering black sash man. "Marshal Bram, you are under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and perjury." Deputies, real deputies who had ridden in with the judge, moved forward and put Bram in irons. The marshal, weeping, did not resist. "Clay Dwyer and your men, you are under arrest for attempted murder, arson, and armed intimidation." "Silas Finch," the judge said, his voice cold, "your assets in this county are hereby seized, pending a full investigation by the territorial court. You are under arrest." Silas crumpled. He was no longer a nation builder. He was just a wet, old man. The rain, which had been a storm, softened. It became a steady, heavy downpour. It was no longer angry. It was cleansing. The crowd was silent, watching. Eleanor stood on the porch, the water running from her hair. She felt light. Tiva walked up the steps and stood before her. He was soaked, his shirt torn, but he stood tall. She looked at him, really looked at him, in the gray light of the new, clean day. She opened her hand. The leather amulet lay on her palm. She held it out to him. He had asked her to carry his words, in case he fell. He looked at the small, wet pouch, but made no move to take it. She closed her hand around it, and then, gently, she pressed it back into his. "No one," she said, her voice quiet, but clear. "No one has to carry the words of the dead anymore. We are alive. We spoke." Tiva looked down at the amulet in his hand. He closed his fingers over hers, holding her hand. The amulet safe between them. A small smile touched his lips. The rain fell. It washed the mud from the boardwalk. It streamed down the faces of the homesteaders. People looked up, their faces turned toward the sky, feeling the clean, cold water. From the small church on the hill, a bell began to ring. It was not a sound of victory. It was not the sound of one side winning over another. It was the sound of order. But it was not Silas's order. It was the sound of the truth. The storm had broken, but the great cleansing rain continued to fall. A soft, steady rhythm that washed the square, diluting the mud and the fear. The victory was a strange, quiet thing. It was not loud. It was heavy, and it was real. Judge Harlan, a man unmoved by passion but deeply committed to the letter of the law, acted with swift, cold precision. Silas Finch, his fine Eastern suit now a sodden, ruined thing, was placed in the custody of the federal deputies. He did not speak. He was a hollow man. His entire empire of paper and force dissolved by a bottle of blue ink. Marshal Bram, weeping openly, was stripped of his badge and put in his own cell. The one Kohia had just vacated, Clay Dwyer and the captured black sash men, their wounds bound, were secured beside him. Their reign of terror ended not with a bang, but with the click of a lock. The judge declared the Finch and Partners' claims, all of them, to be under immediate and binding investigation by the territorial court. He voided the eviction notices for the Horn and Cartwright families and declared that all lands seized under the fraudulent seal were to be returned to their previous owners, pending a full review. The homesteaders stood in the rain, their hats in their hands, some of them crying, the weight of their salvation slow to settle. The town of Larkspur Bend was left without a lawman, without its chief financial patron, and without its identity. It was a town set adrift. In the days that followed, the territorial marshals came and went, taking Silas and the prisoners to Cheyenne for a trial that was already a foregone conclusion. The railroad, its reputation tarnished by its association with Finch, halted its operations, pending its own investigation. The town held its breath, waiting for the next blow. It was the town council, a group of sober shopkeepers and ranchers who had been cowed by Silas, who finally acted. They met in the back room of the general store. They needed a new marshal. They needed something. Eleanor Finch was invited to speak. She was no longer the outsider, the strange niece. She was the woman who had brought the truth. She stood before them, Tiva at her side. She told them that a new marshal would only be a new lock. What they needed was a new key. She proposed a school. The council was skeptical. A school cost money. Eleanor said she would teach for free. She was a teacher, but she had one condition. The school would be open to everyone, to the children of the town, to the children of the homesteaders, and to the children of the Cheyenne and Lakota. There was a heavy silence. Pastor Jerome, his face humbled since the confrontation with his wife, was the first to speak. He said that he had preached of order, but had forgotten justice. He said a school for all children would be the first brick in a house of true justice. It was agreed. Kohia, now free, was seen as a hero by the young men. He was no longer a boy accused of theft. He was the warrior who had disarmed Clay Dwyer, but Tiva saw the restlessness in him. The black sash was gone, but the power vacuum they left was dangerous. Tiva spoke to the council and to the homesteaders. He proposed a new kind of patrol, not a posse, a watch. He asked for volunteers. 2 Elks, the Cheyenne warrior who had once been so quick to anger, stepped forward. Amos Horn, the homesteader who had just gotten his land back, offered his son. Kohia, his eyes bright, was the first to join. They formed a new boundary patrol, a mix of men who had once been enemies, now charged with protecting the true lines. Their first act was to tear down the Finch and Partners fences. Their second act was to build new markers. Eleanor, Tiva, and Navi, who was recovering well at Council Hill, designed them. They were not just wooden stakes. They were heavy stone piles, built in the traditional way, marking the creek and the hunting grounds, and on each, Eleanor herself chiseled the new boundary. She carved the surveyor's mark, the latitude, and the words Red Bluffs Creek beside it. Tiva and Kohia carved the Cheyenne symbols for water and for the herd's path. It was a map made of 2 languages, a promise made in stone. Not everyone was content. Mr. Hames, the general store owner, complained to Tiva that his business was failing. He had extended credit to Finch and Partners for thousands of dollars in supplies, credit he would never see paid. Tiva stood in the store, not as a warrior, but as a negotiator. He looked at the shelves. At the goods Hames had sold to the Black Sash, he told Hames that the railroad would return, but it would return fairly. He told him that the Cheyenne would trade, as they always had, but they would trade for fair prices. He said that a new economy was coming, one based on neighbors, not on masters. Hames, seeing the quiet strength in Tiva, a strength now backed by the entire community, reluctantly agreed. Eleanor found her own peace in writing. She sat in her small hotel room, the one she had first rented, and wrote a letter. It was not to her uncle, who was beyond her words. It was to her father, in the East. She filled pages. She told him of the sky, of the dust storm, of the forged seal, and of the color of the ink on her uncle's hand. She wrote of Tiva, not as a native, but as the man who had shown her the meaning of honor. She did not ask for his blessing. She did not ask for his forgiveness for staining the family name. She stated simply that she had chosen to cleanse the name, not stain it. She told him she was staying. She told him that she expected, from this day forward, to be treated with the respect due a woman who had chosen truth. She sealed the envelope and sent it on the eastbound stage. She felt no regret. She felt free. At Council Hill, Navi sat in the sun, his shoulder healing. He watched Tiva instructing the new patrol, his voice calm, his movements precise. He was no longer just a warrior. He was a leader, a man who bridged worlds. Navi called Tiva to him. He told him that the time of the great wars was ending. The time of the paper wars, the wars of ink and law, had begun. Tiva had proven he could fight both. Navi said he was an old man, and his time as a leader was passing. He was giving the burden to the young. Tiva said he would carry the burden for his people. Navi smiled, a faint, wise expression. "That is your duty," he said. "But duty is a cold blanket." He pointed. "The teacher, the map woman, she is not your duty." He advised Tiva to choose what stays in the heart. "That," he said, "is the only fight that makes the burden light." The seasons turned. The high, dry winds of summer gave way to the sharp, clear chill of autumn. The land was golden, the grasses cured, the sky a deep, aching blue. The new school, a small, sturdy building of pine, stood on the hill between the town and the mesa. Inside, Eleanor stood before a slate, Ampa and the horn boy sitting side by side, learning their letters. That evening, the first true cold of the year settled in. Eleanor and Tiva sat before a fire, not in a camp, but at the hearth of a small, abandoned homesteader's cabin that the community had given them. It was inside the new, true boundary lines. For a long time, they were silent, the only sound the pop and hiss of the pine wood. The quiet was a new thing, a stillness they had earned. Tiva spoke. He told her the full story of the last buffalo hunt. He spoke of the sound, the dust, the feeling of a world ending. He was not mourning. He was remembering. He was passing the memory to her, keeping it safe. When he finished, the fire was low embers. He began to sing, a low, soft song. It was not a war chant. It was not a song of sorrow. It was a lullaby, a song his mother had sung, a melody of the earth, of the stars, and of a child safe in his lodge. Eleanor listened, the sound filling the small, warm room. She felt the last of the tension, the final thread of the Finch name, unravel. She was no longer the cartographer from the east. She was here. She rested her head against his shoulder. She told him that home had always been a word she associated with a place, a large house in the east, a town, a boundary line. But she had been wrong. She looked at him, his face peaceful in the firelight, the sound of his mother's language a comfort in the dark. She said that home was not a place at all. It was the person you were with. 1 year passed. The land, given a season of peace, had begun to heal itself. The prairie grass, which had been choked with dust and fear, grew tall and green, running to the horizon like a great, new sea. The scars from the Black Sash's fires were fading, covered over by fresh growth. The railroad, that inevitable iron spine, had indeed pushed west. But it was a different railroad now, one that had been humbled by scandal and territorial court orders. It followed the path Judge Harlan had decreed, the path of Eleanor's original, truthful map. The trains ran, but they ran south of the Red Bluffs Creek, respecting the new stone markers that spoke in 2 languages. A local treaty, signed in the new schoolhouse by the town council, the homesteaders, and Navi, was filed with the county. It was a simple document, not of surrender, but of coexistence. The schoolhouse stood on the hill, a single, sturdy room of pine that smelled of new lumber and chalk. It was the highest point in Larkspur Bend, positioned perfectly between the town and the mesa, a bridge built of wood and hope. Inside, the morning sun streamed through the new glass windows. Eleanor Finch, or rather, Eleanor Redhawk as some had begun to call her, though the name was not yet official, stood before a large slate. She was not the same woman who had arrived on the stage. The severe bun was gone, her hair tied back simply with a leather thong. Her face was browner from the sun, and the anxiety that had lived in her eyes had been replaced by a deep, steady calm. Her students were a mix that would have been impossible 1 year before. Ampai, the Lakota boy, sat next to the son of Amos Horn, the homesteader. 2 of Kohea's younger sisters sat in the front, their fingers stained with ink, sounding out the strange, angular shapes of the English alphabet. They were learning to write their names. They were learning to measure the land, not with theodolites, but by the movement of the stars. A science Eleanor and Tiva taught together. She would explain the geometry, and he would tell the stories his grandmother had told him, the stories of the star spirits and the celestial paths. On the wall, there was only one decoration. It was not a portrait of the president. It was a map, the true map of the territory, drawn by Eleanor, its lines clear and precise, beside the English names for the buttes and rivers. Tiva had carefully written the Cheyenne names in the new syllabary his people were learning. It was a document of fact and a tapestry of memory. The sound of a horse outside made the children look up. Tiva Redhawk dismounted. He no longer carried the constant burden of a warrior. As leader of the new territorial patrol, his authority was recognized, his rifle used only for hunting. He was lean, and the lines of worry on his face had softened. He entered the schoolhouse, and the children greeted him with a chorus of quiet respect. He walked to Eleanor and stood beside her, looking at the children's work. He had come to walk her home. Their betrothal had been a thing of profound simplicity. There was no church, no pastor. One evening in the late summer, they had ridden to Council Hill. Navi, now fully healed, had met them. The elders had gathered. Tiva had stood before them, with Eleanor at his side. He had not asked for permission. He had stated his intention. He was taking this woman as his wife, to be a part of his heart and a part of his people. Eleanor, in turn, had spoken to the elders. She said she was a woman of lines, and she was choosing to draw her final, most important line here, with this man, on this land. The gifts had been their own. Tiva had presented her with a simple, beautiful pair of sweetgrass braids, a symbol of blessing, of health, and of the earth itself. Eleanor, in her practical, profound way, had given him a new, blank book, bound in fine leather, with a case of sharpened pencils. It was not a book of maps. It was a book for him to fill, with his stories, with his language, with their future. That future had been secured by a final, distant piece of news. A new telegraph agent ran the office in Larkspur Bend, a quiet man who kept to himself. He had delivered a message to Eleanor just a few weeks prior. It was from the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. The telegram had been brief. It reported, without emotion, that the prisoner, Silas Finch, had been lost during a transport between prisons. He had, the report stated, fallen from his horse during a river crossing. His body was not recovered. Eleanor had read the message, her face still. Tiva had watched her. She had not smiled. She had not felt triumph. She felt only the quiet, heavy click of a door closing. A final, dark chapter of her life now finished. Silas had built an empire on the lie of progress, and he had been consumed by the very wilderness he had tried to tame. His dynasty, built on paper and steel, had ended in muddy water, a forgotten, uninscribed footnote. The town of Larkspur Bend had found its new soul, the Javelina Saloon, its name a reminder of the rough, violent past, had been sold. Marisol, her integrity and her ledger having made her a town hero, had bought the building. She had torn down the false front. She had replaced the swinging doors with a solid oak one. She had installed large windows that let in the light. She called it the Crossing. It was a restaurant now and a meeting place. Homesteaders and Cheyenne Patrol members sat at the same tables, drinking coffee, not whiskey. And above the door, a new sign, painted by Eleanor, hung for all to see. It did not list prices. It listed the one unbreakable house rule: hatred not served here. That evening, Tiva and Eleanor sat in their small cabin. The wind was rising, a familiar, mournful sound. But it was only wind now, not a threat. The first chill of winter was in the air. Eleanor moved through the small, clean room. She struck a match and lit the oil lamp on the table. The warm, yellow light pushed back the shadows, creating a pool of calm. She trimmed the wick, her movements practiced, domestic. Tiva went to the bucket by the door and dipped a ladle, pouring clear, cold water into 2 tin cups. He placed one on the table for her. He sat, watching her. The light caught the gold in her hair. She looked up, and their eyes met. They were no longer 2 worlds colliding. They were one. She said, her voice quiet. "The horn boy asked me today. He asked what the children of the Cheyenne call the stars, and Ampa asked me what the white men call the thunder." Tiva nodded. "They are learning." Eleanor sat across from him. "They will be born into a new world. They will have 2 languages." Tiva looked at her, knowing what she meant, what she was truly saying. He reached across the table and took her hand. Her hand was no longer soft, but strong, calloused from teaching, from building, from living. "When we have a child," he said, his voice a low, steady promise, "he will not belong to the council, and he will not belong to the town." Eleanor met his gaze, her heart full. "He will not belong to one side or the other." Tiva nodded, finishing her thought. His own truth. He will belong to the truth. The wind sighed, rattling the window frame. Outside, the great wide prairie was dark, but it was not empty. It was full of promise. On the wall of the small cabin, 2 objects hung, side by side, catching the lamplight. One was the new blank map, its pages waiting to be filled. The other was a small, worn leather amulet, the one she had given back to him, the one that no longer carried the words of the dead, but the promise of the living. The wind moved through the grass, carrying the faint, distant sound of a drum, like the memory of rain on a canvas tent. Freedom had come to Larkspur Bend. It was not loud. It was not marked by fireworks. It was quiet. It was steady. It was as persistent as the grass. In the West, survival was only the beginning. Choosing what was right was the journey. The town, the mesa, the homesteads, they were quiet. There was no great celebration. There was just the land, the smell of wood smoke, and the simple, profound smile of a community that had found its home. Its truth finally returned to its name. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to hear where you are tuning in from in the comments below so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to our channel Wild West Tales. Like this video and give it a boost by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.